Hi again, BookTube. I am here with the next chapter, the 6th chapter of this book collecting game by A. Edward Newton. And chapter 6 is called The Binding. Binding is an English rather than an American art or craft, and it is or was a French or Italian rather than an English one. We Americans are a practical and inventive people. We can erect a substantial and magnificent building or drill for and set 100 miles of telegraph poles in an incredibly short time, or build a complicated piece of machinery that will add or subtract or multiply or divide a lot of figures faultlessly. While our friends abroad are putting a point to a lead pencil preparatory to making a calculation which will afterwards have to be proved. But we can hardly bind a book. Why this is so will be clear after a moment's thought. The system by which an old and complicated trade is learned is not ours. In the European sense, we have no apprentices, and we do not develop craftsmen. If there happens to be a good binder in any of our large cities, the chances are 10 to 1 that he's an old German or an old Frenchman, possibly an old Englishman, who is eking out an existence doing binding for the few of us who appreciate good work, are content to wait a long time for it, and to pay a very considerable price for it when done. Some years ago, a number of gentlemen in New York, members of the Grolier Club, instigated, it would seem, by Robert Hoe, brought to this country a group of expert Frenchmen skilled in their respective arts, and established what was called the Club Bindery. Magnificent specimens of their work, undoubtedly the finest ever done in this country, were dispersed at the Hoe sale in 1911, but money was lost in the enterprise, and the movement came to nothing. And here we have a club binding on a presentation copy of Goldsmith's Traveller. After painful vicissitudes, what was left of the effort went to Garden City and was swallowed up in the organization of Doubleday, Page and Company. There are several excellent, what might be called trade binders in New York, but no one of the standing of Riviere and Son or Sangarewsky and Sutcliffe of London. At the moment of writing, a noble gesture is being made in Chicago by R. Donnelly and Son, whose efforts should be supported as their work is excellent, but in general it may be said that we do not bind in this country. Another and very good reason why the binder's art has never flourished in this country is that never, until quite recently, has it been protected. Until the last Tariff Act was passed, the date of the book carried the binding. That is to say, a book published over 20 years, or a book in a foreign language, came in duty-free, no matter how magnificently and recently it was bound. It was quite usual for booksellers in London or in Paris to assemble a set of books, published at any time prior to 1900, say, bind it handsomely in Calf or Morocco, and send the set into the country quite free of duty. By the last tariff bill, an effort was made to protect the American binder. The book or set of books, minus the cost of binding, is now valued at a proper sum and comes in duty-free only if published over 20 years, and binding, if done within 20 years, is valued at an additional sum, and is subject to a duty of 30% on old books and 25% on new. It is a clumsy and unsatisfactory method, but our ingenuity has not contrived a better, and it affords some measure of protection to our binders. And if we are to remain a protectionist country, and I hope that we may, there is no reason why American bookbinders should not be expected to make some sort of headway against the European bookbinder, who pays perhaps 70% less wages than our own. The free trader will say, let the work be done where it can be done the cheapest and the best. But our great industries were not built up in that way. All were infant industries in my boyhood, and look at them today, the admiration and envy of the whole world. This paper does not pretend to be a technical essay on the binder's art. It consists merely of the more or less casual observances of a book collector who is deeply interested in all things that go into the making of a book, from the moment when it is conceived by the author to the time when, out of print and scarce, it is sought by the collector. Bindings may perhaps be considered in two classes. First, those which were intended primarily for the protection and identification of the book which they cover, and which cost at the time of manufacture only a few shillings, and others which, although they were designed to cover, protect, and identify books, were also works of art, in metal or leather or velvet, encrusted, it may be, with precious stones, or ornamented with curiously wrought carvings, or some other elaborate decoration, not infrequently designed as gifts from one crowned head to another. The amateur who would study these must visit time and again the great museums or libraries abroad. The British Museum, the Bodleian at Oxford, the Rylands Library at Manchester. The Pierpont Morgan Library also has some magnificent bindings. And there are some fine modern French examples in the Spencer collection in the New York Public Library. And at least one gentleman in New York has a superb private collection. But in general, it may be said that we know nothing about binding in this country, and that one is hardly likely to come upon anything better than indifferent specimens in the course of his wanderings through the bookshops in either New York, London, or Paris. We have a fine unrestored Grolier binding illustrated here. In Italy, one may possibly find a few, and if one buys them, he will have to pay an export tax and may indeed be prevented from taking them out of the country altogether. We have a couple more illustrations here. We have another Grolier binding and an early binding in oak boards. The Grolier and the early in oak boards. Lovely reproductions here. The study of museum bindings, then, may be considered as beyond the scope of this paper. I have only one example which deserves to be called a museum piece, a fine unrestored Grolier with an unexceptional provenance. The large and characteristic Grolier here shown is from the collection of Templeton Crocker. We shall now briefly consider the less important examples of binding which may be seen at any good bookshop in New York or London. The first English bindings available to the collector are those which date from the time of Henry. These at the time of binding cost only a few pence. They are for the most part books which are simply but substantially sewed and placed between oak boards covered with leather. A binding in boards means today a binding of the cheapest and flimsiest character, however artistic it may be, either with or without a cloth spine. But originally the term meant just what it said, that the book had oak or other wood boards covered with leather, with clasps of metal, or with ties of leather to keep the book closed. With the passage of time, wood boards, being heavy and clumsy and given to warping, gave way to pasteboard. That is to say, sheets of paper were pasted together, and when a board of sufficient thickness was thus obtained, it was allowed to dry under pressure and became a pasteboard. This was subsequently covered with leather, sometimes with silk or velvet, gradually ornamented and elaborated until the bindings became very magnificent indeed. They may have borne the title of the book only, or more likely the coat of arms of their owner, for any man or woman of sufficient wealth and position to own a book almost certainly had arms. Before considering bookbinding as a comparatively modern art, it may be well in imagination to examine a few old books curiously bound in boards and otherwise. I have one, Boethius's De Consolatione Philosophiae. It is an English manuscript of the 15th century on vellum. The binding is contemporary and consists of oak boards covered with deerskin, let into another piece of deerskin, which completely surrounds it and terminates in a large knot. A lead clasp fashions the outer cover. This book was intended to be carried at the waist, and the knot prevented it from slipping from under the belt of the wearer. We are chiefly familiar with binding of this character from descriptions and illustrations in old books. The British Museum possesses several such on books of a religious character, but this is a lay book, and there are several recipes in English against colic, written on one of the fly-leaves at the end. Owing to the character of the leather, neither title nor arms are stamped thereon, and this may be as good a place as any to say that in olden times, books very frequently had their titles lettered by hand, not on their backs, or more correctly speaking, on their spines, but on their foredge. In such cases, the books, when placed on shelves, had their front edges exposed in order that their titles might be easily read, exactly opposite to the way we put our books on our shelves today. There were a large number of books so displayed in the treasure room of Messrs. Mag's brother when I was last in London. I have another curious old manuscript written in Arabic according to the African fashion, whatever that fashion may be, which is also enclosed merely wrapped in the skin seemingly of a goat, the hair of which still remains on the inside. The pages of the book never seem to have been fastened together. It is accompanied by 8 pages in manuscript, written in a fine hand by a former owner, or Dr. Codington, fully describing it, but I confess never to have read it with care. What I most sought was a date, and this seemingly is lacking. My next example is a book bound for King Henry bearing his arms. In this, the boards of oak, covered with a dark brown calf, the center panels of both covers bear the royal arms of the king, surrounded by a garter stamped in blind, that is to say, without gold. And here is that binding thus described. In compartments on either side of the arms are 4 badges: the Tudor rose, the castle, the pomegranate, the fleur-de-lis, while in a rectangular border around the whole in Gothic letters is a Latin motto. The book is a copy of Pliny the Younger, and it has a special point of interest in that the binder used for the front and back end papers what may have been a unique example of an English Catholic indulgence granted by Thomas Wolsey when Cardinal of York. The upper part of this indulgence is printed in red and black Gothic letters and is in English. The lower part is in Latin, and unfortunately of this lower part only half is intact. The other half has been torn away. It commences, "The most reverend Father in God, Thomas Cardinal of York, Legate de Ladder of the Fee Apocryphati, Chancellor of England, of his goodness and chart, hath given to all that fay this psalm with the suffrages here, after following for the most noble and prosperous estate of our foreign Lord King, the Queen for our day, that they do say the same, etc." Many fragments of curious and priceless books have been rescued from oblivion by taking to pieces very carefully the printed sheets of paper or vellum out of which was made the pasteboard for the binding of books. And a great scholar like Wilberforce Ames of the New York Public Library, who has been the recipient of every honor which the learned of the world can show, is frequently able to tell from careful study of the text and type and the watermarks of the paper whether or not the scraps thus rescued have value. There seems to be little doubt that leather-bound books, ornamented with gold tooling, were brought first to Venice from the East and thence made their way throughout Europe. France, that is to say, Paris, early came and has ever remained the place where the binder's art has flourished as nowhere else. The work of the great French binders, Nicolas Yves and Clovis de Gascon, Padloup and de Rome, has never been approached by the binders of other countries, but their work was usually intended only for king, courtier, or courtesan at the time of its execution. And today, genuine specimens of their work are practically unobtainable. But English bindings have, nevertheless, an interest for us, even if they are not the very best, and these alone we shall consider. The first English binder of whom we have any definite record is Thomas Birthlet, royal printer and binder. One of his first bills for binding is in the British Museum, as is also a warrant signed by the king ordering it to be paid. Birthlet bound books in satin and velvet, but he seems to have preferred leather, calf, white, black, or colored, and gorgeously gilded, as he says, after the Venetian fashion. It is pleasant to know that the bill was promptly paid, as binders' bills should always be. In amount it was £117 6 and 1/2 penny sterling, a considerable sum in the year 1541. In the opinion of Cyril Davenport, not always a reliable guide, Birthlet also bound books for Queen Mary, Edward, and Elizabeth, the latter employing goldsmiths and expert needlewomen in elaborately ornamenting the books bound for her. Some magnificent specimens of which are in the British Library. My only example of Elizabethan binding is a small book, curiously enough entitled De Amour Conjulia, bound in dark brown calf, ornamented with double lines, enclosing the badge of the Queen, a falcon crowned on the dexter side of the mound, a rose tree impressed in gold. The falcon was the crest of the Earl of Wiltshire, father of Anne Boleyn. About this time there lived in or near London an interesting bibliophile, Thomas Watton. He was born in 1521 at Boughton Place in Kent, and came to be looked upon as a patron of learning and fine arts. He had a fine collection of books, and he adopted Grolier's motto as his own, and many of the books bound for him bear the legend, Tom Wattoni et Amoricum. Hence he is frequently referred to as the English Grolier. Queen Elizabeth offered him knighthood, which he declined, and this title was subsequently conferred by James upon his son Henry, of whom Isaac Watton wrote the life. I am able to reproduce a binding from his library through the courtesy of my friend Templeton Crocker of San Francisco, who, hearing that I was interested in English binding, very kindly sent me a choice selection that I might have the pleasure of studying them in my own library. And here we have a book bound for Henry, Prince of Wales. Authors, book lovers, and collectors should try, hard as it may be, to keep a warm spot in their hearts for James I. He had all our failings and a lot which were peculiarly his own. I forgive him his counterblast to tobacco on account of his Bastillon Durand addressed to his dearest son Henry the Prince, over the manuscript of which, in the British Museum, I have several times pored, until I feared the attendant suspected me of designs upon it. It is bound in very dark purple velvet, and the ornaments are cut out of thin gold, finished by an engraver. Above the coat of arms are the initials J.R. The authorities say that this book was bound in Scotland, and that Scottish bindings of early date, like this, are very rare. Books bound for King James after his coming to England are not rare, nor are they fine. I have a citron-colored example, which is characteristic of the period. In the centre are the royal arms, crowned, surrounded with a garter bearing the motto Henri soit qui mal y pense. Each corner is composed of an elaborate design, while the seme, that is to say, the field, is dotted with roses, a form of ornamentation more used for James I than for any other sovereign. English binding at this period was merely a copy of the French, and it is interesting to see a fine French style coarsely copied by an English or Scotch binder, lacking both taste and skill. My James I example formerly belonged to Horace Walpole, and has his bookplate therein, as has also my example of binding for that splendid bibliophile, George II, who, according to Walpole, was made ill by the mere sight of a book. Henry, Prince of Wales, it will be remembered that he was little more than a lad when he died, has been severely criticized for having so many of his books rebound. In 1609, his father purchased for him the library of his tutor, Lord Lumley, an antiquarian of Elizabeth's time, who had what was then considered, with one exception, the most valuable private library of England. But, in justification of Henry's act, it may well be that the Lumley books were in need of binding. In any event, Prince Henry had them bound with his arms and plumes and Scotch thistles, and Tudor roses and whatnot, and those of us who own a book from his library find it a very pleasant possession. It was in the time of Elizabeth and James that embroidered bindings became the fashion. And here we have an example of a superb embroidered binding time of James I. And that is quite intricate. It was in the time of Elizabeth and James that embroidered bindings became the fashion, and these bindings, seemingly so delicate, have indeed resisted the wear and tear of the centuries surprisingly well. It may be that their apparent delicacy was their protection. In any event, there are some magnificent specimens in the British Museum. It was the age of needlework, and the magnificent old mansions, which are the glory of the English countryside, are full of embroidery attributed to the Queen of Scots and Queen Bess. Indeed, had they produced all that is attributed to them, they must have stitched away their entire lifetime, to the total exclusion of the game of politics, which we know they played, one lady losing and the other keeping her head as an exhibit of her skill and lack of it. I hope I am not given to boasting, but I think my own example of embroidered binding at least as fine as any I have seen in any library. It covers a Bible of 1607. Both sides and the back of the book are encrusted with gold and silver thread, while the story of the Garden of Eden and the fall of Adam are told in a picture of colored silks. At the bottom of each side is an inscription, a dream. The back is divided into 4 panels, filled with trees, birds, insects, and the like, and the gilded edges are goffered. For whom was this obviously royal binding made? I do not know. Reference has already been made to the style of binding affected by James's son, Prince Henry. His younger brother's Charles I's reign was too troubled for him to give as much attention to his books and bindings as his early impulses would suggest. A word here must be said upon that elusive subject, the binding of the nuns of Little Gidding. The name is a fascinating one. But what we want to know is, did they bind or didn't they? And if so, what? Nobody knows. It would be pleasant to think of a group of pretty English nuns stitching away at the embroidery covers of the innumerable prayer books and Bibles and the dos-a-doses that have come down to us from the 17th century. But there is no warrant for it, auctioneers and booksellers' catalogues to the contrary notwithstanding. Nicholas Ferrer, who was with the Collets, was the founder of the English Protestant nunnery of Little Gidding, was born in 1592. Up to his 21st year, he led a secluded life, occupied by incessant study. In 1613, he left England to recruit his health by foreign travel, and remained abroad for 6 years. Returning home, he for a short time was in Parliament, but he could not give his heart either to business or to politics. In 1625, when the plague was raging in London, Ferrer and his mother, a most devout lady, left town and took refuge with his brother-in-law, John Collet, at Bourne. Some little time before, his mother had purchased the manor of Little Gidding, Huntingdonshire, and now first the church, which had been used as a barn, and afterwards the manor house, were put in order, and the whole clan of Ferrers and the Collets, the Collet family numbered 14 children, took up their residence there to live a life of prayer and praise and recreative work under the ordering and management of Ferrer. The nuns were his nieces. Each of them took charge of the housekeeping by turns. All the ladies, moreover, besides teaching in a little school, were trained surgeons, and they wore black stuff gowns, all of one pattern and always the same. It was one of Ferrer's principles that everyone should learn a trade, and the trade practiced at Little Gidding was that of bookbinding. An ingenious bookbinder was entertained to instruct the whole family in the art of binding, gilding, and lettering. Visitors were welcome if they chose to come, but nothing was allowed to interrupt the regular course of daily life within the house itself. On this charming but slender foundation, apparently, has arisen the legend that there are books about that are the work of the nuns of Little Gidding. The nearest thing that I ever saw to a Little Gidding binding, to know it, is a large book of common prayer, the Psalms and Bible, which bears the inscription of Joyce Collet, one of the nieces, which was used as the family Bible, on the blank leaves of which is a manuscript record of the births and deaths of the family in 1683 to 1719. It is a superb book bound in crimson velvet with a rose-stamped border, but it can hardly be the work of amateurs, such as the Little Gidding ladies appear to have been. I am able to illustrate the binding of this book also by reason of the courtesy of Mr. Crocker, and I wish that I could be certain that it is what it purports to be, a Little Gidding binding. Beverly Chew, whom I once consulted on this subject, told me that he had never, to his knowledge, seen a book that was the work of the Little Gidding nuns. And here we have the book just described. I once received a letter from an anonymous correspondent setting me right as to what kings were and what were not in the best fashionable society. Queen Victoria, I was told, herself remarked one day when she was about 50 that she heard with surprise that she was not in, nor was James I. Charles I, the martyr, had too many troubles for him to discover whether he was in or not. But Charles II was in. Undoubtedly the first three Georges were not. George IV, as Prince Regent, was undoubtedly led London society, whether let us not inquire. The Prince Consort was laughed at by society. King Edward always led. King George V never. The present Prince of Wales leads it. Perhaps he may have thought he was leading the best American society during his stay, a year or two ago, on Long Island, but this as it may be. Curiously enough, the kings that were in all patronized the binder except George III. He was a great collector of books, if he dissipated somewhat his empire. With the return of Charles II from his travels, as he wittily referred to his exile, the art of the binder flourished in England as it had never done before, and as I feel it has not done since. The supreme name of English binding is that of Samuel Merne. Among the documents in the Record Office is one reading, Charles II, by the grace of God, King of England, etc. Know ye that we are credibly informed our beloved subject Samuel Merne of London, stationer, hath in the art of mystery of binding books certain knowledge, and we do by these presents appoint him the said Samuel Mern, the bookbinder of us, etc. Napoleon once remarked that he had found the crown of France in the gutter, and that he had picked it up and put it on his head. Samuel Mern might have paraphrased this remark, but unluckily we know very little about Mern. His name does not appear in the Dictionary of National Biography, and the best authority on English bindings, Gordon Duff, in a paper entitled The Great Mern Myth, says Samuel Mern was a politician, a bookseller, and a publisher, not a craftsman. And we have here a Mern cottage roof binding. He was a searcher for Charles II for scandalous books, not scandalous in our sense, but books that taught popish practices or false doctrine, in favor of, or maybe it was against, infant baptism. Like our own bootleggers, he is said to have seized merchandise to destroy it, and then sold it to his own profit. He died in 1683, and was succeeded by his son as bookbinder, bookseller, and stationer to the King Charles. The son lived only a short time, and he was succeeded in office by William Churchill, but no authority has ever spoken of him as a binder. A binder was, in those days, a humble craftsman. It took very little capital to become one, and John Bagford, to whom we are indebted for what little we know about Mern, refers to a man named Suckerman as uncommonly skilled in gilding. Maybe it is to Suckerman that we are indebted for what are commonly called Mern bindings. John Bagford was a shoemaker and leather merchant who had a turn for collecting. Anything that related to a book, prints, broadsides, title pages, designs for bindings, and information relative thereto, anything and everything he packed into the 64 folio volumes, a sort of glorified scrapbook, which is now in the British Museum. But whoever is to be credited with what are called Mern bindings used the finest leathers then obtainable, and however he may have been influenced by the French binders of the period, he invented or perfected one important and distinguished contribution to the binder's art. I refer, of course, to the cottage design. Mern bindings, as I shall continue to call them, fall naturally into three classes: the rectangular, in which there is a panel formed by the lines conforming to the volume itself, usually with important center ornamentation and farther decoration at the angles; the all-over, in which, as the name implies a geometrical or conventional design entirely covers both sides of the book; and the cottage, which usually consists of a rectangular panel in which the upper and lower lines are made to take a gable shape, as in a cottage roof. In these bindings, it was usual to avoid the sharp apex of the gables by breaking them inwards, and perhaps leading them into the elaborate center ornament, so that the cottage effect is not immediately noticed. But to describe a binding in mere words is like attempting to suggest the beauty of a color or a perfume. They must be seen and carefully studied before their full beauty is apparent, and as in every other form of art, the more one knows, the more one enjoys a fine example. One specimen of Samuel Mern, I brought it from Pickering and Chatto, for a Mern covers a copy of Butler's Hubrius. It is described as being a fine example of contemporary red English morocco, super extra gilt with royal arms on sides and royal cipher, CR, with much more of lesser interest. Butler's Hudibras, pretty dull today, if truth be told, except for a lot of phrases which are now part and parcel of our daily talk, was Charles II's favourite poem. Curiously enough, Mern, according to the records, found innumerable Bibles and prayer books in his best manner for the roisterous king. Did we not know that Charles II spent much of his time with and his money upon the ladies? One might suppose that his favourite occupation was the pious one of giving away these books, bound with his arms, and it is quite in character that when he went to church, a Hudibras went with him to while away a tedious sermon. The school of Mern, however, continued until it was finally absorbed in that of a binder who was second only in influence to Mern, Roger Payne, and here we come upon a character, if you will. With Roger Payne, we enter at last upon a period of which something is definitely known. He was born at Windsor in 1739, and for a short time worked for Thomas Osborne, the bookseller who had the distinction of having been knocked down by Dr. Johnson with a copy of his dictionary, if a legend is true. But no doubt Johnson more correctly told the story to Boswell when he said, "Sir Osborne was impertinent to me, and I beat him." Through the kindness of another bookseller, honest Tom Payne, but no relation to Tom Payne, the author of The Age of Reason, to whom we Americans owe so much, Roger Payne was set up in business as a bookbinder, and with his brother, and later with another man, Richard Weir, and Weir's wife, became the leading binder of the metropolis. He worked assiduously, giving his personal attention to the commissions entrusted to his care, and he was scrupulously honest, but he was a drunkard and lived in misery in an alley just off St. Martin's Lane. I have a small example of his binding, and I never understood how he came by his great reputation until several years ago, through the kindness of Dr. Henry Guppy, the librarian of the Rylands Library, I had an opportunity of carefully examining some fine examples of his work, bound for his great patron, John Earl Spencer. These are indeed superb. Well, to some extent influenced by his predecessors, as all binders since time have been, Payne in a large measure took his own line and kept it. His best work was usually done in straight-grained morocco of either dark blue, bright red and olive, or citron color. The sides of his books are frequently almost plain, while the spine was elaborately tooled, and quite frequently there was more gilding on the doubler or lining inside the book than on the outside. Payne did not make his display for the casual. His ornamental devices were small circlets, crescents, stars, acorns, roses, dots, and running vines and tiny leaves. Yet with this seemingly meager assortment of irons, he succeeded in producing some of the most beautiful of semi-modern English bindings. His end papers were usually stained by himself to match or contrast with the cover of the bindings, and an amusing feature of a transaction with Payne was the receipt of a characteristic bill. Collectors try, and almost in vain, to get a fine binding and a fine bill. They do not now often come together. If the bill is interesting, the binding is not, and vice versa. I have a fine, if small, example of his work, genuine without a doubt, and a fine bill, but alas, they do not mate together. The bill refers to another book. I paid dear old Jimmy Tregasis £50 for it many years ago. It sets forth in great detail what was done and the itemized cost thereof. Payne's chief patrons were Earl Spencer, the Duke of Devonshire, and the Reverend Clayton Crackroad, the famous bibliophile who, at his death, bequeathed his books to the British Museum. There they may be studied with delight, but undoubtedly his masterpiece was the Ecclesias, bound for Earl Spencer, and now with the original and diverting bill, as Dibbin calls it, in the great Rylands Library in Manchester. If you, reader, ever have an opportunity of examining it, don't miss it. It is one of the finest bindings ever executed in England, and it cost the noble Earl just £16 7s. The last years of Payne's life were tragic. Ruined by drink and dissipation, he was kept alive by the charity of his friends and former patrons, who buried him, when dead, in the churchyard of St. Martin's in the Fields. I secured a curious portrait of him at the sale of the library of my friend Beverly Chew. It was published after his death, and shows him at work in his shop, with his unkept hair, his curiously elongated visage, a picture of misery and distress. Reprints of this portrait, slightly colored, are common. The original was published by S. Harding, 127 Pall Mall, March 1st, 1800. And here is that painting described. Suckerman, Mearns Gilder, is not an English name. Payne, as I have said, is the first English binder of whom anything is known. The names of other famous English binders, Baumgarten, Calthober, Stragmeyer, Heyday, Riviere, Zadensdorf, Sangorski, and Sutcliffe seem to bear the stain with which I began this paper, that binding is a continental rather than an English art. Who was Edwards of Halifax, the next important English binder? Was he a binder? Was he a craftsman himself? Or did he keep a shop and give his name to a certain type of binding? I have searched the books, and I have asked the question, but without result. Occasionally a London bookseller has cleared his throat as if to say something wise, and then changed his mind. If I was able to throw some light on the subject, it is because Arthur Swan, who long functioned as an auctioneer, now became a bookseller, and a good one, sent to England and secured from several sources a batch of data which I have digested. The founder of the firm of Edwards and Sons was William Edwards, a bookseller and binder who set up his business in a stable in Halifax in Yorkshire in 1763. He had 3 sons, but it was the father who originated the bindings which bear the name. He settled 2 sons, James and John, in business in London in 1784, under the name of Edwards and Sons. The establishment was in Pall Mall. It specialized in fine books, and James became opulent. He it was who, in 1785, took out a patent for the famous vellum bindings with which the name Edwards is associated. Like our own Dr. Rosenbach, he became a distinguished collector as well as a bookseller, and his great possession was a book known as the Bedford Missal. It is claimed that this is the most beautiful book in the world. In any event, it ranks with the famous Book of Kells, and is a book with a history. It was made for John, Duke of Bedford, and his wife Anne. John became the son of King Henry IV of England, presented by the Duchess to King Henry VI on Christmas Eve in the year 1430. It later became the property of Henry II of France, and so on. It is a book 12 inches high, 8 inches wide, and about 3 inches thick. It is, of course, a manuscript, but it is not a missal, nor is it a book of hours, nor any other recognized service book. Its special beauty lies in the magnificence and number of its illustrations. The great book came up for sale at auction in 1786, and George III sent his librarian, Mr. Nicol, to examine it, and on receiving his glowing report, expressed the intention of buying it. "It will bring a high price, your majesty," said the librarian. "How high?" asked the king. 200 guineas, was the reply. 200 guineas for a book, exclaimed the queen, putting down her knitting and raising her hand with horror at the idea. "Still, I'll have it," said the king. "But as the queen thinks 200 guineas enough, I'll not go higher." And he didn't, but Edwards did. He bid 203 guineas and got the book. Edwards sold his stock and retired from business in 1805, married, purchased Harrow Grove, a famous old manor house not far from St. Albans, which had been the country residence of several archbishops of Canterbury. But he kept the Bedford Missal. 10 years later, being in poor health, his library was removed to a house in George Street, Hanover Square, and sold at auction on April 5th, 1815. The famous book being bought by the Marquis of Blandford for 687 guineas. But the Marquis, like other extravagant book buyers, having no ready money, had to borrow £500 with the book pledged, and it remained in pawn, so to speak, for 18 years. When it was again sold at auction for 1,100 guineas, and it is now in the British Museum, where I examined it last summer with an attendant standing by to turn its leaves. This is a long digression. We shall now return to the business in Halifax. When the founder died, he was succeeded by his son Thomas, who united with bookselling the sale of patent medicines, as was not unusual at that time. He specialized, however, in bindings and became famous for books with 4-edged paintings, books bound in Etruscan calf, and books bound in transparent vellum, for which a patent was in the family. All of these appear to have been produced in Halifax. Slater seems to think that James Edwards took out a patent for 4-edged painting. This is a mistake. This same process was employed by others, and it was a development of painting a title or otherwise decorating the foredge of a book. It consists of fanning or spreading out the leaves of a book and having fastened them securely, of painting the edges in such a manner that the picture will show only when the book is open, as it was when the work was done. When closed, the painting will disappear. 100 years ago, this form of decoration was very popular. It is a pretty, if rather petty art, and whoever practiced it must have been kept busy painting characteristic English scenes, peaceful landscapes of the countryside, a river perhaps with a bridge or a church or a castle in the background. I have a nice example, bought 20 or more years ago. It is on a copy of Gray's Poems, bound in the straight-grained crimson morocco of a century ago. The view is of Stoke Pogue's churchyard. The book was printed in 1800, and the binding has a stamp on the edge, not inside, bound by Taylor and Hesse. We have no reason to believe that they were binders, but we do know that they had a shop at 93 Fleet Street, as from that address they published Edmonion for Keats and Elia for Charles Lamb. It used to be said that this was a difficult art, which I never believed, and that it was a lost art, which I doubted, but quite recently the market has been flooded with books in nice old straight grain Morocco binding and having seemingly new and pretty forage paintings under the gold. If the art was lost, it is evident that someone has found it and is doing very well with it. If a bookseller seeking to sell a genuine old example, if indeed there are any left, tells you that the new are inferior to the old, just laugh at him. The patent granted to James Edwards was for a method of rendering vellum transparent, so that a painting on the underneath side shows through. On account of its color and surface, vellum soils easily. A book bound in vellum in Edwards' manner, with its decoration in watercolor or in India ink on the underside of the vellum, may be easily cleaned without injury to the decoration. I sold several fine examples of these bindings at the sale of the books of a busted bibliophile in New York in December 1926 for about half what they cost me in London 10 or 15 years ago, so little intelligent interest is taken in bindings in this country. And here we have an example of an Edwards of Halifax binding with that portrait in the center. I still have one of the finest bindings in this manner that I had ever seen, with the exception of the prayer book with the arms of Charlotte, Queen Consort of George III. They are on now in the British Museum. James Edwards was a gentleman, and he lived on terms of intimacy with all the great book collectors of his day, including the noble Earl Spencer, the founder of what is now the Rylands Library in Manchester. Edwards died in 1816 at the age of 59, and was buried in a coffin made of the wood of his bookcases in Harrow Church. On the north wall of the chancel is a tablet to his memory. I saw it 2 years ago. It has a long inscription ending with the text, "Mark the perfect man and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace." And be it remembered, the man was a bookseller. Let us have more such booksellers, the more the better. One more name remains to be mentioned, and we are the binders of yesterday. Thomas Gosden, the sporting bookbinder, as he was known to his friends. You will search the English reference books in vain for anything more than a footnote in regard to this interesting character, but the late William Loring Andrews of New York made a special study of him and published it in a charmingly illustrated book, An English 19th Century Sportsman and Bibliophile. On his business card, Gosden described himself as a bookbinder, publisher, and print seller. But he was more than this. He was an excellent sportsman with rod and gun, and an ardent antiquarian. He spent a great deal of his time poking about in churches and graveyards, making drawings of tombs and tablets, and if truth must be told, making them not over well. I have several of his drawings, one of the stone coverings of the grave of Dr. Johnson the poet's corner of Westminster Abbey, and another of the tomb of Isaac Watts. These are simple in character, and from the evident lack of skill shown in these and others that I have seen, which are grotesquely out of drawing, I am quite certain that he did not himself design or draw the exquisite little tools of flies and fish and reels and rods and baskets, to say nothing of the sportsmen themselves, very much in miniature, as he is sometimes said to have done. Nor is it necessary that he should. He created a style, that is enough. Examples of the Gosden bindings cover almost invariably books on some form of sport. They are not now too easy to come upon, owing perhaps to the fact that there is a group of collectors in New York, led by David Wagstaff, who have been buying them assiduously for some years. I have one anecdote on the origins of antiquity of horse racing, which he himself published from his address in Bedford Street, and several on angling, which seem to have been his favorite recreation. And here we have a Gosden binding in the corner of the page here. One of his most common bindings is also one of his best. It is a copy of Walton's Angler bound in dark green calf. On one side of it is a portrait of old Isaac, and on the other, a portrait of his friend and disciple Cotton, while above and below are emblems of the sport with which these names will ever be associated. The sides appear invariably to have been stamped in blind, and I am of the opinion that one large brass stamp was used to crush the design into the leather. The back is tooled, partly in gilt and partly in blind. Loring Andrews says that this binding is found so frequently that he is of the opinion that it was used upon an entire edition of the Angler. But he adds, and I agree with him, that it is quite as satisfactory as one entirely tooled by hand. Either necessity or choice made it necessary for Gosden to change his business location at least 3 times. He is known to have had a shop in Piccadilly and St. Martin's Lane and Bedford Street, Covent Garden. It was from this address that he published an engraving of the famous sporting picture, The Jovial Fox Hunters. The original painting is now in the possession of my friend, Harry Worcester Smith, who, among his many other sporting distinctions, not long ago rode a steeplechase against professionals and won, thus repeating at the age of 60 a distinction which he first achieved at 30. Needless to say, he keeps himself, as all sportsmen should, in the pink of condition. The cup that cheers as well as inebriates and the delight of strong cigars after dinner are joys that are not his. To return to Thomas Gosden, he seems never to have heard, or if he heard, he forgot, the old adage, keep your shop and your shop will keep you. He came to a sticky end. He neglected his business, became bankrupt, and, dying suddenly, was buried in the churchyard of St. Clement Danes. He will ever be held in affectionate remembrance by all collectors of sporting books. But Thomas Gosden, interesting figure though he was, can hardly be said to have left any impress upon the art of the binder. That distinction belongs to the man we call Samuel Merne and to Roger Payne. Payne's influence indeed is present today, although it may for a moment have been eclipsed by the over-elaborated style with which the names of Sanderson and Sutcliffe are identified. Happily, there is promise of return to the simplicity of Payne and his immediate successors. Payne died in 1797. His followers were Herring, Colthaber, and Lewis. Herring, who worked for Payne, inherited his tools and imitated his manner, but he was not as particular as Payne in the selection of his leathers, and his work lacks distinction as the work of a copyist always lacks the character of the master. Charles Lewis's work I like better, and I am able to show a fine and characteristic specimen from the collection of my friend Mr. Frank B. Bemis of Boston, whose motto, perhaps unconsciously adopted, is "Only the best need apply." And we haven't gotten here yet, but on the other page here we have a Dutch silver binding. About the middle of the 19th century, there flourished in London a commercial binder. That is to say, he was largely employed by the trade, whose binding possessed the merit of simplicity and delicacy, yet with hardly a trace of decoration. Excellent sewing, forwarding and lettering, the use of very thin boards, making, nevertheless, covers which lie very flat. These are the sterling qualities with which the name of Francis Bedford is associated. Read between the lines at the bottom of the inside cover of a book bound in plain crushed Levant Morocco, and if you read, and you may need a magnifying glass, the name of F. Bedford, you may be sure that the book is well bound. If washed, that the job has been well done. Who he was, who his successor is, I have been unable to discover. Living in Delisford, a hamlet in Pennsylvania, so far from the seat of knowledge, information that is commonplace in London is here difficult to secure. Today, the best English binders are Messrs. Revere and Son, Zansdorf, and Sanderson and Sutcliffe. The first two are noted for good sound work in crushed Levant Morocco, the latter for a type of binding much affected by collectors who value bindings more than books. I refer, of course, to those over-elaborated covers, which are nevertheless works of art, only I have the feeling that they are somewhat out of place on a book. It has been said, and truly, that books cannot live without bindings. In like manner, I should like to suggest that Sanderson and Sutcliffe bindings are so beautiful that they do not require books, they are themselves works of art. There remain to be mentioned an abomination known as treecalf, an invention of one Clark, sometimes a partner of Francis Bedford, I believe, and the beautiful Dutch and German silver bindings, usually found on books of devotional character. These, like Sanderson and Sutcliffe examples, always seem to be more bric-a-brac than books, but collectors will wish specimens of all, and good examples are becoming very scarce. Beverley Chew had some fine examples, which at his death were bequeathed to the Grolier Club. We have here on the left a finely chased silver binding and another example of silver binding on the right. A word may be permitted on the subject of books bound in vellum, a fashion that came back with William Morris and his Kelmscott press. Anyone who wishes books bound in vellum with ties may have them. They are not for me. They are impossible to hold and to read, and should one lay down to fill one's pipe, and a book and a pipe should go together, lo and behold, the binding is curled up beyond recognition. I may be told that the ties will prevent warping, true, but who wishes to tie a book closed as he puts it down? And did William Morris forget that ties never last? Hardly an important 16th century book, but had its ties or clasps. Where are the ties now? Almost invariably they have disappeared. One other great binder, perhaps the greatest, remains to be named, Thomas J. Cobden Sanderson. He was, I venture to say, the last and the greatest of the Victorian craftsmen, as Morris was the first and best advertised. It was Mrs. Morris who suggested to Cobden Sanderson the idea of becoming a binder after he had nearly killed himself with uncongenial legal work. He was a small, insignificant-looking man. I once sat next to him at dinner, but he was so shy that I could get nothing out of him, and was the husband of a militant suffragette. Doubtless his wife had scared him so that he lost the power of speech, but he was a great binder. He served an apprenticeship under de Coverley, whom he quickly excelled, and his naturally fine taste was improved by his careful study of the masters of his art, French as well as English. His finest bindings are signed by himself and dated. Subsequently, he established the Dove's Bindery, and in 1900, after the Kelmscott Press had ceased producing, the Dove's Press. Of this press, the finest example is said to be the Bible in 5 quarto volumes. Personally, I do not care for it. I have the old-fashioned idea that a book should be made to read, and I doubt if the Dove's Bible can be read. I should decline to call a book bound if in boards or in boards with a cloth spine, or bound in any manner less substantial than cloth. But perhaps I am wrong, for as the paper out of which the book is made is simply wood pulp, which will disintegrate with time, it is hardly worthwhile to put a durable binding upon it. But 50 or 75 years ago, when rag paper was yet used, not necessarily linen rags, which is practically non-existent today, books were sometimes very substantially and beautifully bound in cloth. I am able to show several examples of such bindings, one of which is upon a book bearing the imprint of Dayton and Wentworth, Boston, 1854. The gold stamping on this book is almost as bright as the day of issue. And we have more examples of wonderful bindings here. I am sometimes asked, can you give me the name of a good binder? I have a set of something or other, which is falling to pieces. The binding is broken at the hinges, and I should like to have it rebound. My reply invariably is, unless the set is valuable, which usually is not, the best thing is to tie it up with a piece of string and put it on the top or bottom shelf of your bookcase and forget it. If you bind it, it will cost you more, probably, than if you went into a bookshop and bought a brand new, a better set. Our commercial machine-made bindings are fairly good, but they are bound in quantities. Good binders cannot afford to bother with odd jobs of binding, unless they are well paid, and the cost of material is high and good labor is scarce. And if it is a waste of money to have a set of any but the finest books rebound, it is frequently to reduce your highly prized volume by 80% of its value to put it in the binder's hands. This statement requires explanation. We may suppose that one has picked up a very valuable book upon a stall for a few shillings. The book is in tatters, it may lack one or both covers, it may be short. Be such a volume as one has either to bind or to throw away. In that case, go to the best binder you know and carefully, very explicitly tell him what you wish done. The book must be very carefully collated, not a fraction of its size to be lost. The edges are to be gold on the rough, and it is to be put in a plain, crushed Levant morocco jacket and lettered so and so. Then you will have saved an old book, and every time you see it, you will still feel a certain satisfaction, and wish the book were in its original condition. The temptation to bind is almost irresistible, but it should be overcome. It is, I admit, difficult. One looks at one's books in shabby, shaken cloth covers from which perhaps library labels have been unskillfully removed, and thinks how much better they would look if decked in full or half leather with perchance some little ornament or emblem or mark of ownership, which the book would then carry to its dying day. But this impulse should be resisted. The books must be allowed to remain as they are, I have a rival, Morris L. Parrish. He specializes in the moderns, in Carroll, of which he has several hundred items, in Trollope, Meredith, Hardy, and a lot of others. And, wise man that he is, he won't touch a rebound volume at any price. He is a patient man and can afford to wait. It is not much fun to go to your shelves and get down a book to show it to a friend and then have to apologize for it being in binding. Mr. Parrish is so extreme in his views as not even to approve of Solander's cases. He keeps his books in cases with glass doors inside, which are dark shades on rollers to keep the light from fading the original cloth covers. Any book which has been in a lending library from which a label has been skillfully removed should be carefully examined before placing it upon one's shelves. Any book, any bound book, no matter how thin it may be, should have its title lettered on its spine. Nothing is more annoying than to look for a book on a shelf, having no clue of its identity, except its size and color. Is this the volume you are looking for? No, you take down another and another, muttering things the while, which will not bear repeating. A word may be said in regard to the effect of coal gas and illuminating gas on books in old bindings. They are most harmful, and unless great care is taken, it will be only a few years before the leather shows signs of disintegration, especially at the hinge, and presently the binding will fall to pieces. To keep bindings in good conditions, it is well to have them treated occasionally by an expert, or if one is so minded, he can secure the necessary preservatives from any good binder. Messrs. Zaendorfs of London make and sell an excellent compound, known as Hutchins Curator Preservative, also a leather veneer, which is said to give excellent results. But I have never found it wise to compete with a craftsman, unless one is very neat and dexterous, like my friend William Macy Stone. One is apt to make a mess of things. Indeed, I should, I think, prefer to be my own dentist and have an expert look after my books. No reader of this book will know better than the writer how imperfect it is. The subject is a difficult one, and opinions may differ. But I have endeavored to make only such statements as I could substantiate and illustrate, with examples either from my own collection or from the much finer collections of several friends to whom I am greatly indebted. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. The next chapter here, chapter 7, is titled The Auction Room, and I will be back on Friday. I'll be back on Friday with The Auction Room.